When we talk about ethics, we typically concentrate in ethical conduct of research, less so on how we analyze the data. And in the last 2 decades, but mainly in the last decade, psychological researchers started to investigate whether famous studies in which they showed some important effects, and those studies were published and then they went to the media, or they had an important influence in psychology. They are, for example, in textbooks. Well, researchers tried to they did that. They conducted the research in the same characteristics, in the same conditions as reported in those studies, and they did not find the results found in those studies. Examples of that is one of the power pose, like participants were in a physically had to stand up and be in a position of power. And then they obtained some measures, and they found out that those measures of confidence, even physiological measures of confidence, were improved in the group of people who were in this power pose. Now, that study didn't replicate. Another example is lots of biases in social psychology, priming studies, in social psychology. For example, in a study, participants were doing a task in which they heard a story about old people, and another group heard a story about young people. And that was not the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study was to see whether those stories affected how much it took for the participants to walk from the lab to the exit door. And they found that people that were exposed to a story with old people, they took longer to walk from the lab to the exit. Again, these type of studies didn't replicate well. And in a famous, a very important study in a article in 2011, Simons, Nelson and Simonson in 2011 talk about the false positive psychology, and they coined this concept of researchers' degrees of freedom. And the idea is that researchers, they exercise a lot of degrees of freedom to obtain a p-value lower than 0.05. Remember that is the typical threshold that is used in psychology to determine whether a study is significant or not. So why do researchers do a lot of things and also non-ethical in order to obtain that? That's because typically academic journals don't publish articles that are not significant. So if academic journals don't publish those articles and researchers spend their time and effort to do the research and they don't get the reward of getting published, then there are incentives for the researchers to do things that are not correct in order to obtain that result. Of course, we're not talking here about fraud, like faking the data. This is fraudulent procedure, and it's very rare in psychology, although there are cases, and they led to the retraction of some articles in some journals. But the most frequent thing is this thing that Simons et al. Coined as researchers' degrees of freedom. And here I'm going to give 4 examples. One is the conducting interim analysis of data to decide to stop collecting the data or not. And basically the idea is this: you collect data, you do an interim analysis. If now you obtain a p-value lower than 0.05, you stop collecting data. And if you didn't, then you continue collecting data until you do another interim analysis. And if you obtain a value lower than 0.05, then you stop collecting data. Well, what's the problem of that? The problem of this is that the p-values we calculate depend on the plan. So if your plan is to collect data until you obtain a p-value lower than 0.05, the sampling distribution you have to use is different. So you cannot use the same sampling distribution you would have used if your plan was to collect, let's say, 50 participants and stop there. So this is one of the ways that researchers exercise degrees of freedom when they shouldn't. Another case is, again, interim analysis to decide which variables to exclude or combine in the study. This typically occurs when in survey studies. So you ask participants to fill in a survey, and then surveys typically have a lot of variables. So some of those variables are items within an inventory, and they may group together very nicely. But others are less formal measures, and one thing that researchers can do to increase their probability of obtaining a p-value lower than 0.05 is to do an analysis, and then, well, it's not convincing. So now let's combine 2 variables that are similar. Well, that improves, it lowers the p-value. Sometimes researchers said, okay, well, this variable is not useful, so I exclude it. Well, so all these decisions affect the p-value because you need to calculate the p-value in a different way if you plan to do these things. But it's not. So we calculate the p-value and we do these things that we shouldn't. Another researchers' degrees of freedom is the use of interim analysis to choose the hypothesis. So I collect the data, do an interim analysis, and based on that, I choose the hypothesis. Of course, this is absolutely wrong. The hypothesis should be chosen before starting the study. And the other way that people try to increase the importance of the study is to report, for example, when surveys are used and you've got a lot of variables, only the variables that produce a significant result are reported and the others are ignored. So this is another way of exercising degrees of freedom.